because there's some kind of great pointers in there, things that we're bumping up against more and more in terms of saying, employers are often saying the education training system isn't delivering what we want from it, but not being able to articulate fully what that looks like or what that means. And I think what Ewart's trying to point out is, in fact, sometimes we're finding that the conversation is around just the skill, when in fact it's the organisational change, organisational design that's actually part of the conversation that we need to be having. So, so I think it's a really interesting kind of learning for us all as we kind of move forward. But kind of any questions that are kind of learned or clarification?
I have one. I'm just wondering what you were seeing in terms of workplace pedagogies in all of this. I mean, I'm talking at a very, very broad macro level, and I understand that it's a multi-pronged approach, but I guess where we're coming from at the moment is what does that actually mean in terms of engendering ways in which people learn at work?
Okay. Yes, I mean, there is now quite a lot of research evidence to suggest that how people learn is very much bound up with how they work. How they work is very much bound up with how they can then use their skills. There's a significant body of research that suggests that if work is organised in ways that actually give workers a significant degree of autonomy, that give them significant job challenge, and that you can then start to configure work in ways that allow people to learn from their colleagues, to be mentored, to have in place semi-structured ways of learning on the job in terms of project work, job rotation, skills broadening. But the key thing seems to be the way in which, the degree to which the work is gradually increases its challenge to the learners. In a sense, they've got actually confronted with problems that require them to learn something new. I mean, it sounds pathetically obvious, but many employers structure their work in ways that after the first 2 weeks there's nothing new to learn because the job isn't changing in any way and there's no further job challenge to them except to keep on doing that job. David Ashton and various other people have done a lot of research on this. There's a monograph on my centre's website, Scope's website, by Michael Arrow, from 2008, that actually does a complete literature review of exactly this topic. And it suggests that from all the research we've been able to glean, there are ways in which you can increase the job design, the learning content of jobs. And a very interesting example was between comparison that was done between both entry level and then later in career nurses, engineers, and accountants. And curiously, the nurses were both the best and the worst examples of how you could actually get people to learn in the workplace as new entrants. The best if you got it right, the worst if you got it wrong, because sometimes it was too demanding and the stress levels went through the ceiling. The people who were most consistently good at it were the accountants. They basically had an apprenticeship on, where they were actually structuring the work in ways that people learned through doing, were mentored by colleagues, had access to internal resources to fill in gaps in their knowledge as they went, and that this had actually been planned into the actual work processes. So not only wasn't sending people on courses, it was actually embedded in the very nature of doing the job. And there's a huge amount of evidence that suggests that you can begin to design workplaces in ways that do that.
It's a very big conceptual shift, I think, for organisations to realise that the learning is actually involved in the work itself.
Yes.
Because we tend to conceive of learning and development as end-on things rather than something that's embedded.
Yeah, I mean, plainly there's a large industry out there who would like to sell you a training course. And sometimes a training course is the answer, but it's not always. There are plenty of other ways of doing it. And I think what's interesting is that professional workers, a professional initial education and training, has always recognised that. And it's interesting that the 3 examples that were picked for this particular study were basically professional work. What it showed that they were quite good at doing that. You can also see it in Northern European models of apprenticeship, but otherwise it's quite rare. And in the Anglo-Saxon world, for people who are not in professional work, there is a tendency to give them some initial training, and then as and when they need anything more, a very, very short course, but not much more than that. And I think there is a huge opportunity change the nature of training so that it's much more blended, and to actually start thinking, how can we increase people's knowledge, their experience, how can we rotate them around, give them slightly more challenging tasks to do, because we will ultimately get both a more experienced, skilled and reflective worker who you could begin to deploy in ways that are different from the narrow little job channels and boxes that we currently put the workforce into. But it's not easy. And plainly for HRD people and for trainers, this requires a significantly different skill set, which comes back to a point that Wallace is always making about capacity. Without building the capacity of many organisations to think about work organisation and job design, to think about skills utilisation, to think about training in different ways, progress will be difficult. So there are some key issues around actually developing the support capacity, both inside and outside organisations, to go down this route. Because the current model is basically a default position. It's often to design jobs that are as simple as possible, which actually minimise all these. They minimise these problems, but they also minimise all the opportunities that come.
I often get employers asking me, oh, these Gen Ys, how can I get them to stay longer? They just want to leave.
Yeah.
And then I say, well, we're getting more and more people who now have degrees.
Yes.
So our training levels have gone up. And then they get people into their, and they, in their ads, they go, this is a great organisation and we're going to do fantastic things. And the person gets there, and as you say, a young person, within 6 months they've learned everything there is to learn. And then the employer will expect them to then just do that job for 5 years, which is just, it's just not sustainable. And so it's not really the fault of the Gen Ys, it's actually the fault of the design of the workplace.
I'm very sceptical about Gen Y. I know that it's very popular, but I do have some worries about it. I'm sure there's a great interest in it. Each generation is different to the last. But it's not there. I mean, it's not they live in some sort of ICT bubble. It is actually because they are much more highly qualified than their predecessors. Their expectations have been quite often raised through going through education, and they actually find themselves doing really mundane jobs that 20 years ago they could have got without any of these qualifications, or far fewer anyway. I mean that's actually a key element that's driven the Scots. And the Scots have got wild levels of overqualification. In the UK workforce as a whole, we reckon that overqualification is hovering at around 40% of our workforce have a level of qualification higher than is needed to both acquire the job and then do it. And that's been rising steadily. It started to rise in recent times very sharply for graduates. Many of you will remember that NCVR survey about 3-4 years back that suggested that 38% of Australian employers thought that the bulk of their workforce was probably somewhat overqualified for the jobs they were doing. Now, leaving aside the fact that people get bored and want to leave, that's a huge waste of public money. You've actually trained people, and then not having the opportunity to deploy those skills in any way that's like to repay the cost of them having acquired the skill in the first place. That seems to me to be a bad situation, and it's certainly something that's got the Scots jumping up and down with horror. They've spent such large sums of money and they're not getting the payback. And I think the other thing is that many jobs in design have no clear progression routes out of them, so there's nothing that people can aspire to. And employers are then initially surprised when people leave. But the really dangerous thing, as I suggested back during the presentation, is that many employers then adjust their systems to basically make the workforce as disposable as possible. So, okay, we've got high level turnover, alright, we've shoved that, we're not training them, we'll break the jobs down even further, we'll have really short training times, and we expect to lose them. But many call centres actually say that 50% turnover in an English call centre in labour a year is acceptable, because 50% of them will just get bored of this ghastly working need. We accept it, we'll bring in another lot. In fast food chains in London, when we had tight employment markets, 350% labour turnover a year was not unusual. Now, what does that say about the trainability of those jobs? And in a sense, you get into a vicious circle. People leave more, you reduce the training time, you break the jobs up into even narrower things. Many English employers in food manufacturing, because they've got rotten jobs, have actually designed jobs that can be done by people who speak no English, to make it easier to bring them on with workers. Now, if that's the way you want to go, then fine, but the consequences for your organisation, in terms of being able to upgrade, and in terms of labour turnover, are bad. The consequences for the rest of society, I would argue, could be dreadful. So I think the way to help tackle labour turnover is in part around role broadening, but it's also about simply treating workers perhaps slightly nicer. Not something we like to do in England, if you can help it.